So now it's counting down to 0, and once it hits 0, then I have to start. And I will discuss about React Finland first. What our current plan. Yeah.
Sorry, your slide says Vodcast number 1 with Pedro Duarte and Raj Hazra.
Yeah. Sorry. Yeah, that's something I forgot to fix. Oh no. Of course, I should have checked that one, but it's okay for the next time. Yeah. Yeah.
Good catch.
Yeah, I have to do more generic slides or videos, so I don't have this problem. Cool. All right, so here we go. Sorry about the mistake in countdown. I forgot to update the text. But I'm Juho Webselainen from React Finland, and now we, for the second podcast or video podcast, whatever you call it, we're going to discuss accessibility. And before we move on to the topic, we actually have a date for the conference. So it's going to take place at the last week of August, and then it goes to September. So it's going to be 5 days, most likely online event, and if you're a little bit lucky, we can run something local as well at the same time, but it's a hybrid conference. But just to move on to the topic, this time, as I mentioned, we're going to focus on accessibility, and I have 3 experts. So I have Nicolas Steenhout, Amy Carney, Eeva-Jonna Panula. So hello, everyone. So maybe, Nicolas, you can tell a couple of words about yourself, who you are and what you do and so.
Who am I? Oh, gee, that's a big question. I'm Nick. I'm an independent accessibility consultant, and I've been working around accessibility for a very long time now, back to the mid-1990s. I work primarily with fairly large organizations, whether it's Fortune 500s or educational providers. I work also with a lot of e-commerce. I've been involved in open source for a long time. And basically, I help people make the web more accessible. So that's me in a nutshell.
Yeah, that's great. And maybe, Amy, you can tell a little bit about yourself.
Sure. My name's Amy Carney. Hello from Alaska. I've been in web development for about 8 years, web design and development. And in the past year, I kind of struck out on my own for independent consultation for accessibility. So I started my own company, DigiLoo, and I do contract work for accessibility consultation, remediation, training, whatever the need is at that time for usually smaller organizations, and still try to keep my hand in web development because that's what I like to do, is get into the front end code.
And last one, we have Eeva-Jonna Panula. Maybe you can say a couple of things.
Yeah, hi. My name is Eeva-Jonna Panula, or Eevis. Some of you might know me by that name. And I'm a software developer at Futures. And I've been doing mostly front-end related things for the past few years. And I'm also, feel like I'm forgetting who I am at the moment. So accessibility, I can just go with that from here. So I've been doing or learning about accessibility for like a couple of years now too. I'm actually a certified professional in web accessibility, so I'm certified. And I have to say that actually one thing that helped me with the studying was Amy's blog. So I can really thank you for that. It helped me get through the exams.
And good job completing it.
All right, so that gets us to the topic. So how do we define accessibility? I mean, my own thinking is that everyone can have accessibility issues. So let's say I'm using a phone and I'm forced to use it with one hand because I have something else in my other hand, or you have glasses. So if I take away my glasses, then I don't see so well. Or maybe it's too bright outside, or there's some environment conditions. So how do you think about accessibility? So what's your thinking? How do you define it?
For me, accessibility is about building inclusive websites, inclusive applications, inclusive experiences, and absolutely it's good for everyone. And it helps to think in that way. At the same time, we have to keep remembering that first and foremost, accessibility is for disabled people, because if we forget that, then we kind of make it less important. We forget the primary audience for what we're doing. And let's face it, there's between 20 and 25% of people with disabilities worldwide. So that's a large number of people that we really shouldn't forget about.
The percentage on this podcast is more than that.
Yes. So there's 4 of us talking and 3 of us have a disability. So there you go. Now maybe it's a little bit biased that the disabled folks are talking about accessibility, but there's this thing, nothing about us without us. So it's good that we're voicing why it's so important.
Yeah, and it's a surprisingly big amount of people that cannot see colors, or they have they mix some colors. So it's something to consider. So it's they have a lot of little things that you don't think about, and I guess that's one of the key points about accessibility. So it brings us some understanding about what possible things to consider in our work.
Yeah,
that's a big thing.
There's this expression that's been going around in a lot of disability circle, is that you have disabled people and then you have temporarily abled people, because everybody at some point in their life will have a disability, whether it's because they broke an arm and they have a temporary impairment, or they have a situational impairment, like you were saying, Juho, that you're outside in the sun and you're trying to look at something that's got gray text on gray background on your phone. That is a situational impairment. So we all encounter these barriers.
Yeah, and we all get older. So as you get older, maybe you cannot see the small text anymore, or you get some new things. So it's sort of that's something you cannot avoid, at least yet. So it's one thing, one factor in this discussion.
Definitely, and there's such a range. You can give generic labels or something that encompasses people, like, oh, somebody has a visual disability, but what does that mean? And even if you say low vision, what does that mean? Because that could vary from person to person, each one. So my low vision is not the same as somebody else's. And so I'm sure it's the same of cognitive disabilities. That's such a huge thing. That's probably the largest category. But there's so many little things to it, and one ADHD person is going to be different from another person who has ADHD.
So what do you think of cultural factors? I come from a Finnish culture, maybe I expect that certain things are a certain way. And then I go to Germany or Austria and they have their own thinking. It takes a while for me to get used to this way they think and do things. Do you think that's a part of accessibility as well, or culture?
I think culture has an impact, but it's not really, it's more part of the user experience at large than accessibility specifically. But I guess one thing that your comment triggers for me is that we, as developers, we have to keep remembering that people will not use our products the way we expect them to. People are not all going to be using a phone to access our application or a desktop. Maybe they're going to be using a TV because that's the only way they have to access the web. Or maybe they're going to use an assistive technology called a Braille and Speak, which is like a little laptop that doesn't have a screen. It's got a Braille output. Maybe people are not going to be using a keyboard to interact with your application. Maybe they're going to be speaking into a speech input, or maybe they're going to be using their eyes to look at an on-screen keyboard to type things in. So we have to think in ways that are neutral as to what we expect, because people use different modalities, different assistive technologies to interact with our products. So in many ways, maybe it's a cultural thing in some ways, but it's also tying that thing that people are going to do things with our products that we don't expect. So we have to plan for that.
Yeah, and I think there's also some like generational gap or generation thing to consider. So I send a lot of SMS with my parents these days because I'm preparing a house. And one thing they cannot do, for whatever reason, they cannot send me links and they cannot send me photos. So it's sort of, or my mother can send photo of a screen. She cannot take a screenshot, but she can send me a photo of the screen. But I mean, that's how they do it. They are not maybe so much in this technology part, which might have some impact on how you design. So,
and I think how culture might impact accessibility too is the way they think of disability, and maybe they're making their own judgments or what people are doing or where they belong. And just how you define it. I think that could change how people want to make things accessible, or whether they have a different type of belief or how they were raised in that area. So I feel like for the most part, the US is striving, and we have our laws, but even across the US, because we're so large, people have different opinions about disability, and then how are they inspired to help or not help at all?
So maybe Eeva-Jonna, do you have some thoughts on accessibility or ideas, something to add?
Well, I could say I agree. I'm just listening and nodding that yeah, I agree. But I think, like, I don't remember who said something about like or that something that raised a thought in me about like how the society around us or a person thinks about, for example, disabilities, and how they are raised inside that society that affects how we see the need for accessibility, for example. So if like people with disabilities are seen as a like, well, bad thing or something like yeah, sorry, I can't find the word for what I'm trying to explain here, but like then it's kind of yeah, sorry,
That's fine.
yeah. Yeah, but I'm trying to say that like there are so many unconscious biases that we are not like actively thinking that, okay, this thing is necessarily like something that we don't want to think about or like take into account or like make things accessible, but because we have been raised in a society where like some things have been seen as like, well, negative or like just something that like I don't know if you can kind of get what I'm saying and try to maybe rephrase the thought or something. I'm sorry.
No, it's fine. I think it. Yeah, I guess the point is that the way we are raised up, that's going to give us some values or some view on the world, and it might not include certain things that are useful in this type of work that we do. Like consider the web or web development. You need some kind of you need to see it in a very broad manner to create accessible apps. In a project, I think it was 2 years back, what I learned is that we had these power users, and they like to use keyboard, and then as it happens, having access to providing access to keyboard and doing focus management the right way, so that you can do all the things, all the actions of the application just by keyboard instead of the mouse. That's a big thing for power users as well. So it's accessibility feature that provides tons of value for power users. So we went power users first, but as a side effect, we got something that's accessible.
It's funny you mentioned that. Go ahead, Amy.
I was just going to say that we're always going to design for ourselves. So just like you were saying about, we have our biases, and for me, I have the advantage of I will design with bigger font sizes. I will be checking contrast, because if I can't see it, then it's not going to work for other people too who have my same disability. So there's things that I naturally am designing for: high contrast, larger font, keyboard, because I definitely go between of sometimes the mouse is just a burden of finding my pointer cursor, and if I can just tab to something quicker, I will. And so other people who aren't doing the same type of internet navigating as I am will design the way that they find it easiest, or what works for them, or what's pretty to them, or whatnot.
So Nick, you wanted to say something about the...
It's just, you raised something about power users. It always amuses me that most coders are so into keyboard. We do everything by keyboard in our IDEs, and then we get on the web and then we forget the keyboard. So maybe throwing an idea out is that if you're really into using the keyboard, remember that keyboards are actually one form of assistive technologies. Keyboards were invented in the 1850s to help deaf people communicate faster with hearing people. So remember that, and when you go on the web, just use your keyboard. Forget your mouse, forget your trackpad, and use the tab or shift tab to navigate, and use the spacebar or the enter key. And it's a little bit what I'm going to be talking about soon with interactive elements. But go to nomouse.org, nomouse.org. Check it out and take the challenge and share it with your colleagues, your friends, your family. Share it with everyone, because keyboard interaction might just be one of the biggest problem on the web for so many people, because it's not just people that are sighted that rely on keyboard, but we're also talking about all screen reader users. We're talking about switch input users. We're talking about speech input users. So the keyboard, making sure everything works for keyboard users is one of the primary things we want to do for accessibility. And as developers that we like our keyboard shortcuts so much, why don't we carry that over to the web?
Yeah, that's a great point. So it's sort of, if you design keyboard first, as a side effect, you get something that's useful for a lot of people. So maybe we should move to your first live demonstration. So we can, maybe Nick, you can share your screen.
Yeah.
I'm running this loop here, so another round. Okay.
Okay, so
System over. Here we go. Now
you got me?
Yes. You can go. Yep.
Cool. So one of the things I encounter so much when I do audits is that sites use framework, whether it's Angular or Vue, or in this case, what we're talking about, React. A lot of times, semantically neutral elements are being used, whether it's a div or a span or whatnot. So we're using those to recreate, whether it's buttons or links or other elements, custom selects and whatnot. And one of the biggest problem with that is they don't work for keyboard. So this quick demo really is to give an idea of the different things we need to do to make something work. So here we have a div. I've given it a class of bouton, which is French for button, just because it came that way. And if I click on it, if I use my mouse, I hover over it, it's got a red outline so we can see the difference. If I click on it, I don't know if the screen share showed it, but there's a dialog that opens that says you clicked, the alert opened. So that's fairly straightforward. But if I try to tab to it, I can't actually tab to it at all because there's no way for a keyboard to know that I need to tab to it. So if I'm wanting to be able to tab to it, I have to add a tab index value. Here I have tab index 0, which means that an element that is not natively keyboard focusable can receive keyboard. The other value that you might want to use is tab index -1, where you want to be able to put programmatic focus on an element that would not natively receive it. As a side to that, do not ever use positive tab indexes. You don't use 1, 2, 3, or like I found in an audit last year, 4,237, because that changes the native keyboard order. So someone who's expecting to tab through a form or through a page, and suddenly you start changing the tab order by adding positive values, that's going to be really, really problematic. So anyway, now we have the same button. We can highlight them. I can click it. But if I tab to it, suddenly I just use my tab key. I have keyboard focus on it, but I cannot trigger it with either the enter key or the space bar, because there's nothing there to actually make it work. So we really are having to build layers upon layers upon layers of things to actually make this element work. I can add more stuff here. So suddenly we have another div that has the same class. We have a tab index 0. We've assigned it a role of button. So suddenly we use ARIA attributes to define the semantic meaning of this thing. So a screen reader user that's navigating by keyboard gets to the element, and their assistive technology is going to say, okay, this is not a div, this is a button. Well, it wouldn't say this is not a div, but because we've assigned it a role of button, suddenly the assistive technology is able to decide, right, this is a button. I'm going to announce it as a button, and the assistive technology user, the person who relies on the screen reader, will expect certain behavior. So they would expect to be able to use the enter key or use the space bar to actually trigger behavior. So in this case, I can tab to it. So I can tab to my first button that I add tab index 0. I can tab to this I'm a div, but just putting a role of button doesn't actually give me this heavy lifting of this is what I'm expecting. So if I hit my enter key, nothing happens. If I hit my space bar, nothing happens. So now that we have created a fake button, we also have to add a whole bunch of JavaScript to make it work. So we're seeing how we're starting with just taking a div, and then we have to add different attributes to build it, to try and make it work like what a real button does. This is a problem because it's so easy to forget to do something. It's so easy to forget when we're putting in our event listeners to put in the on enter, but we forget the spacebar event listener. So we're having to do so much to recreate the native experience of semantically meaningful HTML. The best way to do something like that is to actually use the button element. Strangely enough, HTML has the button element, and that button element has everything built in. You don't have to give it a tab index because it is natively keyboard focusable. You don't have to give it a role of button because, hey, natively the semantics of the element tells it it's a button. And you almost have nothing to do to make it behave a certain way because it knows to listen for the enter or for the tab. So if I tab to it, now I can use the enter key and something happens. Now, my message says you clicked, even though I actually used a keyboard. But I didn't have to code anything for this to happen. So here we have a fairly straightforward example of what we need to do to make an element behave like a button compared to what we have. One of the benefits here is, of course, that we gain performance. Our code is going to be maybe 50%, maybe 60% lighter for just that one element. So if we replicate that across all the buttons, the links, the select, custom select, and all the things that we actually normally build with our frameworks, we just build so much bloat into our code. So using natively semantically meaningful HTML means that we actually can create more performing pages. So we cut the amount of data we're sending. We can do the same thing with links. We can do the same thing with select. I mentioned that. One thing we don't want to do is try to build links that behave like buttons. So, for example, one of the things we see a lot is so we see that kind of stuff a lot, where we have the A element, we have the href, and then we're giving it a role of button because we want it to look a certain way, we want it to behave a certain way. And then because we don't really understand keyboard interaction, we also put in tab index 0 for good measure. So the first thing we would do is remove tab index because the A element is natively accessible as long as we have an href attribute. And we don't want to give it a role of button because we're changing the behavior of it. We're changing the semantics of the element, and so much can go wrong from an accessibility perspective when that happens. So instead of doing a role button, we really want to just use a button. That's really is, use the element that's meant to be used, and you're going to get a lot of accessibility built in. So that's my 10-minute intro, just to open it up, and I'd love to see if there's questions or comments, or how do you think you can implement that in your work using React on a day-to-day basis?
Yeah, that was a great demo. I think we see a lot that people they use they don't use the right elements. I think sometimes the issue is that let's consider something like select, and you want to do complicated select that has let's say you have a select element that has tokens inside, and then it has customization when you open the select thing. That's where the things get tricky because you cannot do this custom features on top of the default elements in HTML. So
I would suggest to you that these custom behavior inside of select elements are actually not worth it. They're cool, they're cutting edge, they're all these things that's really faddish, but when you're coming down to it, what really is the important thing is that people are able to complete your workflow.
Yeah.
And if you haven't thought about everything, and I guarantee you it's jolly hard to do because I see it all the time. I must be looking at custom selects once or twice a week, every week, and nobody gets it right. I mean, I'm not kidding. Nobody gets it right from an accessibility perspective. So, why do we keep on doing that?
Yeah, I guess the other favorite thing to re-implement is date selection. So we have a date selector or time selector or this kind of thing. So I see this a lot, that instead of using the native thing for it, you use some custom thing. And normally there's something wrong. It's missing something or it doesn't work the way you expect.
Yeah.
So since we're live on YouTube, I hope some people have questions, because now it's a good time to answer those. Yeah. If you don't get any questions from YouTube, maybe our other speakers have some questions or notes.
I can
No
I can
question.
comment. Using the semantic elements or the native HTML elements, it's also a good thing to do for other developers, because it's so much easier to read a code which uses those elements that tell what they are. For example, buttons, instead of, okay, there's a div inside a div inside a div inside a div, and yeah.
Yeah,
So,
it's true. And I was wondering too if JavaScript is less intimidating for people who are especially JavaScript developers, as opposed to the only thing you really do need to concentrate on is you can style a button. And I know that's intimidating for some people, is you have the default styling. And so they want to do it all just the way they want to do it. But you're still styling. So as Nick showed, it's pretty easy to just pop in one for another.
Here's the thing, though, Amy. The average 4-year-old knows about 400 words in their native language, right? Whether it's German, Finnish, French, English, about 300 to 400 words. There are about 150 really important HTML tags to remember. So I actually don't buy that someone who has enough experience and practice to build really complex application using JavaScripts, I don't buy that argument that they're unable to actually get comfortable with HTML, because they can actually learn HTML better than a 4-year-old is able to speak their own native language.
yeah, that's a great point.
Yeah, I agree.
So, I mean, if there are any no other comments or questions,
maybe I should just say something that might segue into Amy's presentation. But I've worked with a big client for 6 months, and the one thing we were doing is we were doing remediation on a very old code base. The code base was about 12 years old. And they had to fix a mess of divs and spans and stuff. As we were talking about, it's hard to figure out which bit does what. And it took them 6 months to actually fix a handful of pages. So do your future self a favor and do it right now.
So, I mean, there's one thing that's interesting to consider is this legislation. So I guess different countries have different approach to accessibility, but I think you might get something from the government side to tell you that you have to do certain things on an app. So you know this much better than I do, but how do they specify that? Let's say you have a law where you have some rules. What's the level of the rules? Like how is it defined if you consider like United States or so?
It changes a lot from country to country, but overall, whether you're in Europe or in the United States, you have pretty much the same level of rules that are saying that A, you can't discriminate against people on the basis of disability, and B, you have to make your websites accessible. And generally speaking, the reference is the Web Content Accessibility Guidelines, WCAG, and mostly it's pushing for the current version, which is 2.1 level AA. So that's a certain number of success criteria that need to be met, but it's tricky. There's always people that will argue, and there's also problems of interpretation. So it is tricky, but it's better to do more than less. In the United States, there's I think it's 4,000 web accessibility lawsuit a year every year, something like that. So in Europe, there's less lawsuits, but it's coming to be a problem. It will be a problem for developers.
Yeah, I think it also depends on the business. So I was doing one client case, and the client was pushing really hard on not doing accessibility features. So the client was like, we do the features, the application features, but we don't focus on accessibility. So we don't do this extra things. For them, it was extra cost because I was a contractor. I was literally the more time I spent, the more time. I mean, the more time I spent, the more money they spent. So for them, it was expense. So they just told me, don't do the accessibility bits. Just do the features, do the thing we want.
This is the thing you want.
Yeah. So
I think the argument too of I see people either they feel like they can hide behind, well, it was unintentional, but then again, if this is your craft, if this is your profession, why is accessibility not in your skill set? You can learn all this other tooling, you can do the next new shiny thing, but what about this thing here? And so people think that, well, I didn't know. Well, that's not really good enough when the law, especially the Americans with Disabilities Act, has been around for 30 years. How can you not know that this needs to be in your skill set? And so it's not enough. And people think, well, the law, is no big deal until you get hit. And that's where I've come in, and especially with my consultation, is people who have had at least at bare minimum a complaint. So they're not being sued, but suddenly it's like, whoa, okay, I guess we should do something about it because, well, you caught us. So I guess we'll do something.
Mm-hmm. So do you see particular cost with designing accessibility first? So let's say you start a project, you start thinking about the accessibility early on instead of doing the project and then looking at what's missing and doing the accessibility features. Do you think it makes sense to start thinking about it early on in the project?
Yeah, it'll take a lot less time and money that way. That's the problem is, when somebody has a fire under them for the law suddenly takes notice of their site, then suddenly they find the money for it, but it's not cost effective because then they are literally paying for their ignorance or something that they thought, oh, well, we'll just accommodate as needed, which sometimes even when you offer accommodations, that's not accessible if somebody can't get to your phone number or maybe they're not comfortable doing it that way or can't do it that way. And so if you're not offering the equal access to your information, somebody might not even be able to contact you for accommodation.
Around cost, it's something that always amused me. And people say accessibility is expensive, and yeah, if you have to fix something quick because somebody is throwing a lawsuit at you, it's going to be expensive. But it's a little bit like building a house. If you build a house and you have level entrance and you have a wide door, it's not going to cost you very much more than if you didn't. But then you make a house accessible. If, on the other hand, you build a house and you have 3 steps at the front entrance and your door is too narrow for a wheelchair and suddenly you have to make that accessible, you have to break a big hole in the wall, you have to build a ramp, and you have to do all these things that suddenly is going to be a lot more expensive. But if you did it right in the first place, you're maybe going to see a 2%, 3% increase, which in the scheme of things, it's not that bad. It's also this, Amy and Eva probably know this example, but it's like making blueberry muffins. If you bake the muffin and you try to put the blueberries in after they're baked, you're going to make a big mess and it's never going to look right. But if you put the blueberries in from the start, then suddenly you have a blueberry muffin. And accessibility is the same thing. It's really hard to put accessibility in after the fact.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. Yeah. All right. Maybe it's time to move to the next demonstration, or what do you think? Yeah, let's do that. Maybe Amy can get ready, and then we see some code. Yeah, So as another round, and here we go. And yes, the stage is yours. Can you unmute, please? Oh. Yeah.
Unmute and then get back.
Yeah, it's fine. Let's try again.
Okay.
Oh.
All right. Let me see. Okay. So we have a carousel, and this is one that I've worked on before. It looks, like a carousel. It's kind of automated and moving along just very slowly at a time. And I'm not going to go too much into that. You could have a whole ordeal about carousels. But the main thing that I had been tasked in when I came in with remediation is our auditor had left some notes about how these buttons here, which are actually fairly low contrast for me, I even have a hard time seeing them. And I even noticed you get just a faint line when you go to the keyboard over here of where the carousel is at. But when I keyboard around, I can't get to these little previous and next buttons. And so what the problem is div, is that they were made as divs. Of course, everything functions well as far as if you're a mouse user and you can easily click on there. So they go forward, backwards. So the functionality has been built in, but not even focus functionality is built in. So there's no tab index, even drawing you to there, drawing the keyboard there. So when I was looking at the code here, and so you have this carousel, and what was going on is they have their SVG in place. And what it really needs is a button to make it happen. And so I'll just uncomment, and this is something that I ended up having to build in, is making its own little slide button. And it's a type button. And so, and then what I just did is carried over, they had their whole on click set of what needed to happen. So I wanted to remove that. And then the other thing of having it is any kind of interactive input button needs an accessible label, something that identifies for when somebody comes to the button, they can hear what it does. And so I then created some text, and what I was able to do is bring in from their own styling library is they had some visually hidden. So I had to import that in. And what the visually hidden does is just what it sounds like. It's visually hidden. All I had to do, slowly go down here so I don't make anybody ill, is I brought that down here to make sure it was defined. And I had to bring in some other styling as well for the button. So the button got styled. All I did was make sure that it didn't have any default things showing up that the designers didn't want. But I'm still trying to respect what the designers had in mind. But here I got in a span of visually hidden that was brought into theirs. And what that basically does is it positions it in an absolute way and uses the whole clip and height and width. This is kind of a standard pattern that people use where you're basically pushing it, making it invisible, but it still exists in the DOM. So, but then when a screen reader encounters it, they can then hear that, oh, this button, when it announces button, says previous, so it's supposed to use previous. So what I'm going to go ahead and do is take out a lot of my commenting to show. So sure I've got everything going here so it works right, reloads correctly. Oh, and I have to remove that extra one there. Oh, I know. You need to remove the on click. that one got removed. So we can keep their fancy little icon. I'm going to put this one back here, except this one is left. Okay. Oh, that's right, because I put it in there already. I'm sorry. So I moved the icon down here, and the icon is purely visual. So the ARIA hidden, leaning on ARIA, makes it where they're not going to have to hear that extra information, that it's to help people who want to see it. But then people who can't necessarily see it can hear that it's previous or next. So then going back over, I'm going to make sure that it's reloaded properly. Oh, here we go. Okay, so now when I'm going through, you can finally see that there's some focus going around. We have a real button here, and this is good. So not only does it work with the mouse, but it also works. Let me get back over there. It goes forward again. So yay, we have that. But the funny thing was, I discovered, so I completed my basic requirements of changing it to a real button, and hooray, we have a win for keyboard accessibility and a little bit for screen reader accessibility because they know there's a previous and next button. But what I discovered is when I was testing with the screen reader, I was using VoiceOver, and I would click the button. It would tell me, button previous or next. And then I had no idea, not looking at it, of where I was at or what was being focused. So then it became a whole nother issue that I had to report of saying, okay, we've got these buttons fixed, and sure, they work now for keyboard navigation, and that's great for maybe sighted users, because even when you click, you don't really see or press it with the keyboard or mouse, you're not really seeing any type of focus here. And so you're kind of assuming that what the center is the one that's in focus. And then there's no real focus going to it of, oh, okay, I've selected that. And then that's the thing that's going to be open. So it just goes back to carousels, for one, usually aren't a good idea because a lot of times they're really, really hard to make accessible. And on top of it, this one is extra complicated. So, they not only have this, but then there's a carousel within a carousel, and well, then we've got to go here to make sure that these are properly buttons as well. And maybe they are when I made the fix because they might be drawing from the same component. But again, this whole thing of then suddenly I have no clue of where I'm at. I'm disoriented again if I wasn't looking at the screen, and even looking at it from my perspective, it's hard to see exactly where my focus would be at. When I go through the keyboard, sure, it moves through some of these, but again, I ended up having to use this awesome bookmarklet that I can't remember who made it. I want to say Melanie Sumner, but I'm not for sure. But I was having to force to see exactly where I was at, where the developer should have actually created some sort of outline to let people know, and then let them follow through with that focus. So again, the focus just stays there. And so that's one that is currently in the works, that the button is fixed, but now there's a whole nother thing. And the other problem that comes from this is they are using a third-party Carousel plugin, per se, a package that they decided to use. And so then how much access do I have to that code, or having to rewrite part of the library? So again, that is going to be a long discussion with that organization, and they're going to have to reconsider if they want to keep using carousels. Their designers seem very wedded to carousels and things that can be packaged in small spaces for the sake of screen real estate. So I don't see the carousel going away for certain, but maybe a different way to give access or some sort of alternative format might be available. If you're curious about carousels, in particular, the W3C way, the Web Accessibility Initiative, they do have tutorials about carousel concepts, and that you can kind of go through and see exactly not only who it affects, but also it talks about some of the criteria and the different things that you need to make accessible, what it takes to make a carousel accessible. Again, I would steer clear from it, but I understand that sometimes it's just, there's no arguing with some designers until they see the huge impact that it has on a lot of people. The other thing I wanted to talk about for remediation was some work I did for changing up table layout. So this, is structured in a grid type setting, and it was actually coded as a table. So in the 21st century, we're still seeing people use tables as layouts, but that has a huge impact on screen reader users in particular, because tables offer screen readers not only shortcut keys to navigate around it, but a lot of the information is announced in relationship to one another. So when table headings are given, then the person can hear the heading. When they move into a cell, they know what column header resides over it. And if you're just patching information together just so it comes in a nice gridded layout, that information can be confusing. The weird thing about this one, and just to emphasize it, and you could see it in VoiceOver, and I don't think you're going to be able to hear VoiceOver, but what I wanted to do is show that you can go to all these shortcuts, and tables is one of the shortcuts you can go to in their menu, known as the rotor for VoiceOver. And this shows that there's only one column and one row to this table. But that's weird because there's actually quite a few rows going on. And if you were just evaluating from VoiceOver, what you could see is that this whole thing actually under upcoming deliveries is a table. This is not one table under this Friday, April 2nd. This is not another table. This whole thing is table. So then they slip in these table headers all in between the table datas. And it kind of mucks up the whole relationship of the data. So what you need to do is basically strip out the table elements, and I will flip over to that code. And so what's going on is this is actually all table stuff. They put in all their table structures. And, the funny thing is too, I also wanted to show, is that a tool I recommend a lot to people is the Wave tool, the Wave plugin that can be in Chrome or Firefox. And it's usually really good at pointing out a lot of easy fixes, errors that, you might not have realized right off. And it leaves the tables alone. So you would assume, oh, well, it's all semantic, it's all fine, there's nothing broken here. It doesn't yell at you about the tables. And so again, you're feeling like, oh, this is fine. So going back here, this is one of those things that would actually take a bit of time, because in order to make sure that you're adhering to whatever kind of styling that they've got set up, figuring out what kind of utilities that they have set up for the styling, like a grid utility that's in place, that would just take a lot of time, as opposed to if they just started that from the beginning. Going back over, I would be duplicating that time. And given the time that I'm given for remediation and discussing with the person, we ended up doing a Band-Aid fix. So it wasn't ideal, but it makes it work for screen readers. So what I ended up doing is making this flex table heading component. And basically that gives the date a heading so the person can actually understand you're getting into a different section and, okay, my order for this, and then you can figure out what the order is in the button. I had to first go ahead and remove the table semantics on the table. So it's still a table, but it's not actually a data table. And you use that with an ARIA role of presentation. And that then eliminates the screen reader announcing that it's a table. So again, it's not the ideal way to do that. Using role presentation, I think, should be used sparingly and cautiously. But in this case, in something that they're constantly going through redesigns, it didn't seem like it was the best choice to be using a lot of the time for something that might end up having a redesign. And so that was fixed as well. Another problem that was reported on the page was that the skip buttons all repeat. And they really needed some, in the bare minimum, some kind of visually hidden text, just as I showed for the carousel, that identify its uniqueness. So you want to skip this date. And what that actually does, first let me go ahead and get my styling in place so it doesn't give me errors. I will go ahead and import all of these things, make the styling right. Okay, so I bring in my styling. I use a heading 3 for the table heading, just because you need to have that one navigation point, because again, as I was showing you the rotor for VoiceOver, it has a list of headings. And so you want to be able to go down that tree of heading 1, heading 2, heading 3. And they actually didn't have a heading 1 on this page, which was another thing I discovered as I was working with it. And so let me go ahead and import this too. It's another thing I have to do. All the things you have to think about in React. We'll go up and I'll go ahead and import this styling. Okay. All right. So let's see. Not hidden, never used. Why? See if that works or not. If it's going to break. Okay, so let me turn on VoiceOver to see if you can see the rotor. Okay, so there's the headings. Oh, I didn't get the right skip, I think. But going through, and at least it skips the table, so there's no table 1 now. And I'll have to check about my skip. But the whole idea for this, when you get these form controls, oh, let me go back because I went too quickly. Okay, so you can look at in the rotor menu form controls. And the problem was coming that when you have skip button, skip button, skip button. So some people do navigate this way that they can, for one, get a sense of what's on the page and maybe even quickly get to where they know that they're going. So skip button offers no clue about exactly what that button relates to or what it's going to do for you. So when I ended up adding in the text was visually hidden, so I didn't break the design that the designers wanted. But then I was able to add in the date. So what I was able to do then is take the value. So when I go down, and I was able to actually take the value where I didn't have to hard code anything in and just put that available. So it would take from that identifier and it would repeat it. And I ended up doing the same thing for the unskip button as well, and as well as the undo donation. So then it shows up in the rotor. It also shows up in when somebody tabs from button to button, if they're choosing to tab around, they'll hear it as well. Originally in the audit recommendation Arya described was one recommendation. And then I found out that it didn't show up in the rotor because some of that Arya labeling just doesn't for some reason. And I'm not sure how it works exactly on NVDA. I haven't tested. That's a Windows-based one. But it bothered me a lot. That's something that had so many form controls on it. And it sure would be nice to give somebody who navigated that way. So widening the inclusion and how people might use it, because as Nick had mentioned earlier, you just don't know exactly how somebody is going to use it, and you want to make it as inclusive as possible. So that was one. And then I want to leave you with not only the idea that remediation often takes a lot more time, which goes hand in hand with costing more money, but there are ways with React to be able to set yourself up for success. Usually the Create React app comes with its own, and then the W3C also has table tutorials. I was going to share that with you as well. So React has a lot of great documentation for accessibility. So if you've spent any time in React docs, which I hope some of you have, there's a lot of information about making your React app accessible. So whether it's semantic HTML, I mean, that's definitely a great foundation, and it works in any kind of library. So starting with that, and then going on down, talking about labeling, make sure your form labels have an accessible name with them. And then it kind of touches on a lot of different WCAG guidelines, gives you resources, managing focus. And Nick had talked a bit about that. If you must have something custom or free, you're doing a single page application. Mouse and pointer events, what should be happening, as well as going on to keyboard. Sometime after that, testing with your keyboard is the easiest and easiest, and it's free. You don't have to invest in anything to be able to use that. Going on, color contrast. And I want to get on down to show that testing, there are things that'll help you test. So going to NPM here, this ESLint plugin, JSX Ally or A11Y plugin should come in if you did a Create React app. So it should already be built in. You have a few parameters that you might want to set. And so, but a lot of it goes out of the box. And so you can do your linting and get that testing done before you're even pushing stuff out. And you can try to fix it. It doesn't catch everything, but it sure does help. And I try to tell people, not to disable rules on there. I know I saw that, and I can't remember if it was this table one that I had fixed. Let's see, that's not it. There was one component I was working in, and I just don't remember which one it is now, where they had obviously disabled one of the rules from here. And I couldn't understand it because it was an obvious fail. And it's like, well, that's a good indicator that you need to fix your code. It's not a quirk. It just needs to be fixed. And so I ended up having to fix it and then just removing that rule disabler because it was an actual issue. It wasn't just something like, well, this is kind of an annoyance, let me get it out of the way. So I'd recommend not turning off rules, figure out what's going on. Another one, and this documentation, which seems like it's getting a little outdated, React Axe was one package that you could download. That's what that does, and it's actually called Axe Core now. Axe Core for React. And it shows when your code is compiled, it catches things in the console after the DOM has rendered. So things that, you have your precursor of making sure your code is sound and that you're trying to make things as accessible there. And then when things have actually rendered, you want to make sure that the output actually is accessible. So that will catch that in development to get you a step further. Also, if you're interested in unit testing, that Xcore has some documentation about using Jest. Let me go there. Yeah, so they talk about if you're using Jest for testing, for unit testing, which this organization was. And so I started kind of digging into what they had. It's possible to going further to test little parts at a time. Again, so you can have the tooling that people have worked hard on for linting and all kinds of testing. You have your own tools like your keyboard. And also I'd recommend getting somewhat familiar with the screen reader that's on the computer you have in the very least. So VoiceOver comes built in to Mac, and that's just Command F5 to turn it on. It'll, for the first time when it comes on, a lot of times it'll walk you through a mini tutorial, so you don't have to feel too nervous about that. If you have a Windows machine that you're developing on, wonderful, because that's where the majority of people are at. That I think through stats of NVDA is one of the most common screen readers used. It's free, so you can just download that for free and get familiar with that. A lot of the keyboard shortcuts between the two are similar when you're navigating around. It really helps you see just what's available to people. It gets you familiar with using your keyboard more. And a lot of times I found things by listening or looking, because I always have the text output open for at least for VoiceOver. And I find things that I didn't catch before that I think, oh, this is fine, the code's fine, and I think I've got everything. I don't see any errors coming up in Wave or Axe. And then it's like, whoa, I didn't hear what's supposed to be there. And so that's why I recommend. I would be amazed how many times I found something in just a quick, 2-minute screen reader test of, oh, okay, there's something else I need to work on. Same with the carousel. It's just not something that stuck out to me because I was thinking about fixing those buttons. And then it was like, whoa, I'm getting no orientation of what this carousel is doing. And I can see why these are really bad. So that is what I've got to share.
Amy, thank you so much. It reminds me why I don't like doing remediation. I love to do auditing and pointing out what's wrong, but oh my, just a headache. You folks doing remediation, it's all yours.
It's a constant rabbit hole. But I learned so much though. It's like so I'm not a React developer. I can jump into a lot of languages. I'm familiar with JavaScript. I can do things. I'm great at jumping at people's codes. I don't build React apps myself and projects, but jumping in, I've learned so much about React, what its strengths and weaknesses are. I learned a lot about the tooling out there to help things work better. I get to exercise my accessibility muscles, by seeing like, oh, this is a really big deal. I can see how this would not work for people. And so it keeps a lot of things fresh in my mind. So when I do have cases of doing development, these things really stick with me as well.
So speaking of React, what do you see are its advantages or disadvantages in terms of developing accessible applications? So now that you have seen React code, what's your feeling on it? What are the good sides and bad sides in React development?
Well, I have some personal feelings about React already, but that aside, I think accessibility is possible. I think a lot of people have put a lot of work into, like the documentation alone says a lot to me of how it's achievable, how it's an important thing to consider. And so looking at that, all the people who built into that documentation, it's wonderful. And it's saying you can do this, it's fine, that React can be accessible. And a lot of it depends on you. It's not necessarily just starting the application and out of the box, whether it is or isn't accessible. It's, are you going to write code that is semantic? are you going to build custom things that include people who are keyboard users, screen reader users? And so I don't feel like React is inherently bad in that sense. That is definitely possible. I wouldn't say it's the best or the worst. It's just, I think it really depends on the developer and where they're at and where their focus is at.
Cool. So let's see. We had a question from the audience, but before that, I wanted to ask. So you had this table example. Do you think it would have made sense to use definition list instead of a table? So if you had definition list, then you would have. Sorry, muted at the moment.
Oh, sorry. I hadn't really thought about using a definition list there. The thing about definition list, even though I think it's a wonderful idea for so many things, is that the screen reader support is a little goofy about it. And so when I can use headings in particular, I know that support is there and that somebody who is navigating either with keyboard shortcut of H or pulling up their screen reader menu is going to get there fast. As in the definition list is like, maybe. I think on all screen readers, it's not supported equally. And it's not like an unordered list or ordered list that is well supported.
Yeah, that's interesting information, because I mean, it'll sort of, you have to know which elements you can use and which not. For me, it would have been natural to fix that as a definition list, but then I would have broken the accessibility at the same time. So it's sort of
right. And I feel like maybe if you Google around a bit to search definition list and accessibility, it's not like it's the worst. It's just maybe taking in consideration what exactly you're building, and some things really do make sense for that. But somebody did do, I want to say Scott O'Hara maybe did some testing on that on different screen readers to see just what it was doing. And so I would highly recommend looking that up just to weigh your options. It's not to say that you shouldn't use them. It's just to weigh your options. And in this particular page with the table and the way the buttons were, I was trying to give as much information as possible so it was clear as possible.
No, makes sense. So now we have a question from audience. So Anurag is asking, what's your thoughts on adding area hidden on the icons?
Right.
And because he saw some websites adding it in icons too, like full area label in icons. And in GitHub, they do this area labels in their icons. So what's your thoughts on this?
Right. Well, so ARIA label is well supported, and it does give an accessible name instead of the hidden text. The thing with ARIA label is, well, and a lot of ARIA, when you're doing those kind of labels, ARIA label, ARIA described by, is that you're missing out on the translation opportunities. So your true text that's visibly hidden is going to translate if you're getting into internationalization. And it's not supported on that ARIA labeling. So that's one, depending on what your site is doing and the audience that you're targeting. The other thing is that when I have an opportunity to use something else other than ARIA, because the first rule of ARIA is to not use ARIA if you don't have to. And this is one of those cases, if I can hide text, I feel like you give more people opportunity to access that text for whatever way they might be unexpectedly using your site. And so however they decide to look at it, whatever device they have it on, whatever tools they have in place, user customizations they have in place, that text that's available, you just never know. It might be important to someone else instead of, I feel like you hide it even more inside ARIA label. ARIA label is good, but I've leaned away from it a lot. If I can put hidden text in there, I will.
Yeah, so there's one thing I learned a couple of years back is that sometimes on a website, or let's say you have a landing page, yes, different sections, but you don't want to show the headings. But what you should do anyway is to have heading, but so that it's hidden. So like hidden headings with the right, like heading 2, heading 3, and so on. So you have the right semantics, but in such way that these are like is not visible on the page, but it's visible if you listen to the page.
Right. Yeah, exactly. And I teach that to people in PowerPoint as well when they have to have their slides a certain way, but you still need a title on each slide. And then going back to ARIA hidden, if you're using ARIA label, then you don't want ARIA hidden, obviously, because your label is within there, that you want it to be identified. And on top of that, you might even need a role image, just depending on what kind of image file you're using. But a lot of times, if you could, ARIA hidden, you definitely want to use if you were coupling that hidden, visibly hidden text with it. And then you've got the icon that is purely decorative at that point. And be careful with ARIA hidden. That's another one that you can hide stuff unintentionally, that you wrap one thing and things get hidden. And it's like, whoa, where did my stuff go that I was thinking I was doing right? So I've had a hard time with some people just not using ARIA hidden correctly and not realizing the impact. Testing with screen readers, you will find out where you've used it wrong.
Yeah, that's a great takeaway. And then I got this link. Should I use a carousel?
Awesome. Yes. Thank you, Jared Smith, for making that. That's what I just actually shared with the organization, if they would consider eliminating their carousels. And this was a good resource for that.
Yeah, I mean, I did a horrible thing like 8 years back. So I wrote a carousel with jQuery. And the main feature was that you could put this carousel inside itself. So you could have recursive carousel that has like carousel that has carousel that has carousel, and it just works. But it doesn't make any sense. Like the worst thing you can build accessibility with.
Well, theirs was interesting to me because it's the first time I'd seen so much interaction. So each slide they made each slide a button, so you could access it with keyboard. So somebody had fixed that. The navigation buttons weren't fixed, but each, item that somebody could look at was interactive. So you hit that button, and then of course, I was surprised with all the way they put it in a modal. So not only are you given a modal, which is another thing you have to consider for accessibility to make sure your modal is accessible, then putting a carousel within your modal was like, wow, somebody was very creative in design, but I would hate to be the developer that received that design the first time.
Yeah. So I have something called NVDA. So what's NVDA? Yeah, can you tell something about it? I don't know anything about NVDA, but I have it in...
Right. It's a screen reader. I think nvaccess.com, nvaccess.com or .org. Okay, there you go, thanks. Is where you would download it. And there's also documentation there of how to use it. So they're the ones who put it out. It's open source. And so it's free. You can make a donation for their work.
You should make a donation.
It's true. It's true. As much as I use it, I actually need to make a donation. And it's been beneficial to some of my blind friends as well that I've considered for that, because JAWS, which is the robust screen reader for Windows, is very expensive. So there's a lot of work you can imagine goes into it. But NVDA is a screen reader that works on Windows, and it's commonly used for people who need it. And it works best testing on Firefox, or what was the other one, Nick? Was it Chrome?
Chrome, Firefox and Chrome.
Yeah, because Chrome is fairly new as far as it working really well with it. So yeah, and DQ has some wonderful shortcut cheat sheets that I've often pulled up as well, that it's like a one-page cheat sheet. So if you need to print it out or bookmark it somewhere, it's really good for looking like, oh, how do I get it started talking? How do I navigate a table? How do I move from heading ahead, and how do I open up the menu that shows me what all my heading hierarchy is? It'll get you there. And sometimes that's about all you need for just getting a basic sense of how to run your page through a test.
Cool. And then I have another one, which is called VoiceOver. Yeah.
And that's built into the Mac OS system. It's
Right.
also built into the iPhone. So if you're doing mobile testing, you can do it on there. Obviously, its functions different, more swipe based. But yeah, it offers you the same type of the rotors, like their menu of showing you the different navigation points. A lot of the keyboard shortcuts are similar. Not all are exactly the same, but some are similar. So if you want to go from heading to heading, it usually works the same way. I think landmarks navigate a little bit different.
Is there something you can run like online, like you run Cypress, you run tests against your app? So is there like online service or something where you can get sort of like a video that's explaining how you hear the site, or how do you like Cypress but for accessibility? Does this thing kind of exist? Is there some online services we should know about, or can you test these things online?
Sure. Nick, do you have any recommendations?
There's no similar service that I know about. I mean, obviously, automated accessibility testing tools will give you results in code, but in terms of seeing the page interacted with screen reader, I don't know of anything. But this is a good plug for saying, hey, hire disabled users to do usability testing.
That's true.
You know, you can spend maybe $150 and get a couple hours with a screen reader user going through your website, and you'll see exactly what's going on. And I organize usability testing with disabled users. I've done that for a long time, and I still learn stuff. It's wonderful from the perspective of, does my site work? How does it work? And actually getting a real view of how screen reader users interact with your site. That's just a wonderful thing to do.
Yeah, it makes a lot of sense. I remember seeing services like there was some guy that will roast the design of your site, and there was another one that was selling his service that he's going to get drunk and look at your site. I think eventually he stopped doing it because it's not healthy. But I mean, it makes sense to push this task to people. So.
Yeah.
All right. So, do you have any other comments or ideas related to tooling or React or?
Well, just Amy was mentioning that NVDA is good with Firefox and Chrome. If you're doing testing with VoiceOver, the browsers you want to use is Safari, or more and more Firefox is VoiceOver friendly. So do not use Chrome and Safari, because it's going to give you some really weird results that might be false negatives or false positives.
Interesting.
Yeah. And I was demonstrating VoiceOver on Firefox today. And I found that it's pretty good. And sometimes there's even some slight differences of Firefox was showing up with the quirky table semantic, saying the 1 column, 1 row, indicating there was a table. Safari didn't even show me that because it was just such weird information. I think it didn't accept it. And so that was one weird quirk. So I can definitely highly recommend either or.
All right. So I have one question from audience. So they want to know what kind of method or service would be good for collecting accessibility feedback from web service users. Just a normal service chatting or something else?
Oh, like to say if there's problems with your site?
Yeah, I mean, I guess the way I can interpret this is that, let's say you have a website and then someone goes to the website and there's some issue. So how do you capture this feedback?
Yeah, well, I definitely recommended a dedicated page that can be findable. It's pretty common to see somebody have an accessibility link, and I feel like it's becoming fairly conventional to have that where people can look for. Sometimes it gets so hidden at the bottom of the page. I don't know if I recommend that, but chat services can be inaccessible in themselves. And so unless you vetted that chat service to know that it works well and it's accessible. I wouldn't go that route, but providing a page that says what you've done, what you're trying to meet, as well as just basic contact, either an online form that's accessible or an email or phone number on that page. That's the way I would go to make it as accessible as possible.
Yeah, to tack on to what Amy is saying, I would actually provide more than one way to reach you for feedback, because some people will work better on the phone, some people will work better on just an email address.
Right.
And I have been doing auditing for longer than web chat have existed, and I have never found a single web chat that is actually accessible. Maybe it exists out there, but I've audited a lot of them, and by and large, they are not accessible to some people. So if you're providing that as one way to provide feedback about accessibility, you're pretty much ensuring that the user is going to want to throw the laptop out the window.
Yeah, makes sense. Right. So does anyone have anything else, or should we move to the next demonstration? Yeah, I guess we do the demonstration. So maybe Eeva-Jonna can get ready with your machine, and then we see. Yeah.
All right.
Perfect.
Yeah, great. It's showing. Yeah, I like, before diving actually into the code or demonstration, I want to say a few words about why I'm showing what I'm gonna show. There are first of all, I am going to talk a bit about animation, GIFs, motion, these kind of things. And while they are, like, especially animations, they can be really helpful, they can be really beautiful things. There are people who don't, well, maybe like them, but there are also people who can suffer from, for example, certain kinds of motion on the web. So, like, for example, a person with ADHD might find like a GIF that's like moving a lot on a site really distracting. But like, and also, like, there are other people who are other groups of people who can, well, as said, suffer from those animations or motions. For example, people with vestibular disorders can encounter things like, sorry, I'm really struggling with English today. Yeah. So, like, people with vestibular disorders, they might get, for example, get sick or get dizzy, or like, some people might have to even go lay down for a long time before they can actually continue doing anything when they encounter certain kinds of movements on the web. And I'm actually one of, well, those people, because for me, if I see, or like, if I use a web page where there are, well, parallax scrolling, it can be like, it doesn't make me so like sick that I have to rest for a long time, but it really, like, I get sometimes nauseous, I get dizzy. And also, like, when there are text scrolling horizontally, when I'm scrolling vertically, that's just the worst. So if you remember this marquee element, that's like the thing that I'm basically talking about. And I'm like really sad that there are so many websites that are implementing these vertically scrolling texts nowadays. However, there are things that we can do to use for example, computers, and I am going to show you how to use one of these. Just a sec. Okay, it seems like I can't get my preferences to the window I'm sharing. So I have to be just descriptive.
We can try to share the screen again or so. So the problem.
I think it's okay. I'm gonna just be descriptive with this. So I'm using Mac, and in Mac, in the preferences, there is this accessibility settings, and there under the accessibility settings, there is a display settings where I can toggle this reduce motion setting on and off, and I have it on. And I'm actually gonna take it off now that I remember, because, well, because it would be hard to display this demonstration if it was on. But yeah, okay. But while I'm having this setting on, it affects the operating systems level. But there is actually a media query or media feature that can be queried and to get this value from the operating system to the browser, and that's called prefers reduced motion. And it's like the support for it is pretty good. It's implemented in all the other browsers than Internet Explorer, so like it's a really like usable thing. And what I'm going to do here is that I'm going to demonstrate how to use this value to help me with the GIFs, because, well, with the prefers reduced motion, I could set the CSS animations to like either not to have them at all or to have them as, well, reduced ones. So I'm not saying that all the animations should be removed from the internet, but just like some things. And sometimes like reducing the animations is like enough. And for those who are interested about what kind of movement is problematic, like there is a good article about this by Val Head on Listapart. I can't remember the title or the heading of the article right now, but I can check it a little later. But yeah, let's go into the code. So what I'm doing, I'm gonna first I'm gonna show how to show a GIF for like moving GIF for those who for whom it is okay to see movement, and just a still image for those who want to have like reduced motion. And on the second phase, I'm gonna add a button to play the animation. So those who have chosen to have less motion, they can still like play the animated GIF on demand, but I'm still like showing the still image as a like default thing here. And for this, I have a GIF of cat who's chewing. You're gonna see it in a bit. And also I've extracted the first frame of that GIF to be used. So yeah, okay, let's start. I'm gonna use the picture element here. It's one of these nice HTML elements I've learned during the last couple of years. And picture, well, first of all, we're gonna put the default image here, which is the moving GIF, and it's gonna have the alternative text, so the alt attribute, which is something that is gonna be shown for all the pictures or the sources we're gonna define later here. So yeah, like what I said is gonna make sense a little later. So yeah, yes, and I'm actually gonna add the GIF a little later so that there is not too much animation on the screen. And so I'm just writing the alt text here so that you know what's gonna be there later, and that I don't forget to add it. Right, I'm going to go back there. So yeah, so we are going to put the GIF. I've actually added the URLs here already, so I don't have to remember them now. So I'm just gonna pass that. So a little warning here. There's gonna be movement soon on the screen. I tried to use a GIF that's not moving too much and it's not causing me anything. So like for me it's fine, but I don't know if it's fine for everybody. So I'm giving this warning here. So yeah, all right. Here's the cat. But now, because, well, this is the default thing, but we want to have a different source for those who have this prefers reduced motion on. And for this, we can use the source attribute and element. And it has a media attribute, which can define conditions there, what to show. So I think I've seen this used in places where, for example, a bigger picture is shown to the wider screens, and a smaller one to the not that wide screens. So there's that condition coming from the media attribute. So let's it's source set. That's the first frame, and then here, and so here. Okay, going back there. So here is the condition basically. So this prefers reduced motion is a shorthand for prefers reduced motion reduce. Prefers reduced motion has two values. It's either reduce or no preference. So for those who have explicitly chosen to have this reduced motion, it's reduce, and then for the others, so those who have chosen it and then unchosen it or never touched the setting, it's going to be just no preference. And now I'm gonna put the reduce motion on again from here, from my preferences, which you can see. But now, on the screen, you can see that the movement stopped and there is a still image. All right, so that's the first step here. But we want to have okay, this is a good thing that there is this way to not show movement or show reduced movement or animations for people who want this reduced motion. But sometimes it would be better to give the control to the users, that they can play the animation, for example, on demand when they want to do that. So let's do this here. First, we're gonna add the button, which is going to we are going to need a state of play to toggle the do we want to animation to play or not. And then we are going to need the button and to have a on click handler basically to toggle that value. And then we also want to show that button only to those people who have this this preference of reduced motion. So these are the things we are going to do. Let's do them one by one. So let's start with the state. And that's going to be a false as default. Then okay, here we are toggling the state. And then let's start with the button. And let's give it a text depending on the state. So if it's play, we want to show pause, and then play if it's true, false, sorry. And then we're gonna give the on-click handler here. All right, so let's test this. Here is the play and pause, that's toggling. And I want to add something here. Right now I'm using the ARIA label. And okay, great. So back there, and then let's play. So we are communicating the pressed state also to screen reader users. And this ARIA label here is just play, because if it was toggling like pause or play the same way as the text here, it would be communicating like play ARIA pressed true, and then pause ARIA pressed false, and that wouldn't actually make sense. But yeah, then okay, we have this button. Then we want to actually toggle the GIF or play the animation if needed. So we can just do a check here that if play is false, then we have this source here. So let's test this. All right, the GIF is moving, and now it's paused. And then we need one more thing. We don't want to show the button for people who don't have this reduced motion setting on. For this, I'm using a use prefers reduced motion hook, which is copied from Josh Kammer. Okay, I'm really bad at pronouncing his last name, so sorry if I did it wrong. But that's copied from there. I can give the link later. So that's just querying the value of the prefers reduced motion there, and we want to it returns either true or false. If the user has this reduced motion on, then or selected, then it returns true, and then false if not. So we want to get that one there. We have this, and then we are going to display this only if it's true. Right, so now I have this reduced motion on, so we can see the button, it's playing. If I push it, and then pausing if I push it again. And then now I'm taking the reduce motion toggle off from my settings. So you can see that the button disappeared and the GIF is playing. So yeah, that was basically what I wanted to show or demonstrate.
Yeah, great. So let's thanks a lot, and let's move to the discussion. So I actually have a discussion about this earlier. Let me better now. So Nick mentioned hiring people with disabilities to audit web pages. It makes sense. So where do I find these people, or do you have services in mind?
There's two primary and reputable places you can go to. One is called AccessWorks, and this is access-works.org, where they have a bank and database of disabled users, and they can actually run all the usability tests for you and provide reports, or just provide the disabled users themselves. And then there is Fable. I think they are at fable.com, but not fable.com. Fable usability. Anyway, Fable is makeitfable.com, makeitfable.com. Those are the two primary places I would suggest you go to for hiring disabled users.
Cool.
+1. I would agree with those as well.
Yeah, it's a very, very cool. Maybe you get back to this demonstration. So there's this motion sickness, and if I understand right, then we have a preference on the operating system. And now, as it happens, as we learned, you have API for figuring out if you have the preference on, and then you can actually do something about it. If you detect, and then you can disable all the motion. So
yeah,
that's all right. Cool. There's one more question here. What are the accessibility considerations regarding load indicators? So when you do like this loading bar, let's say we have the famous Windows loading bar.
There's several things you have to keep in mind. The first thing is it can't be visual only, so you have to have the information in text. And as the information changes, the text value needs to change, and that information needs to be available to screen readers. So you probably want to use a ARIA Live attribute on the span or the div or the paragraph where you're actually having the text change. There's a few different ways to change that. You can also use the value attribute on a span that you're changing, but again, it's fairly tricky, and there's quite a few things you need to do to make it happen. The easiest approach remains using an ARIA Live region.
So do we have something like accessibility patterns or like components somewhere online that show how to do accessible something? Like, how do I do accessible select? How do I do accessible? I mean, you already showed the carousel one, but is there like a collection of web components or something like that, which I can look or even use?
I know Carrie Fisher just put out something on Smashing Magazine. So the carousel and table, a few of those are on, and I'll kind of drop that in here just to get to the basic site for you.
While Amy looks that up, one of the places you can really go to as a first port of call is, yes, the UI tutorials. There's a whole bunch of stuff there. That's very helpful. One of the problems we have in the accessibility community is that we have a lot of really great stuff, and it's spread all over the place. So sometimes it takes a little bit of searching to find the right thing, but those tutorials is a good start.
Cool. Yeah, it's always like where to start. It sounds like there's a lot. There's another one.
Yeah, so that's the WAI ARIA authoring practices. I think that's the official name of the document. So there are different design patterns and widgets, how to make them accessible, and what you need to take into account about the like ARIA roles and states and properties and keyboard interaction and this kind of stuff too.
Cool. So I have a question from the audience. How do we deal with loading animations? Is it somehow different than load indicators?
This one is a tricky one, because if you have a page that takes a long time loading, then you do want to notify particularly screen reader users that this is happening. So again, you probably want to use an area live region on the spinner to show that something's happening. But at the same time, if it just takes a second or two, then you have to balance how much distraction and cognitive load you're going to add to the experience for screen reader users compared to not telling them, hey, something is coming. So it really is an evaluation you have to take as to how likely is it to really take a long time loading. And I would suggest that if you have assets that take long enough to load that you need to have a loading animation, then probably your stuff is bloated and heavy and not performing enough.
Yeah, that makes sense. I mean, I guess in some way, performance is a part of accessibility. So making things perform fast, it likely helps. Yeah, so there's a collection of components, inclusive components, that designed by Hayden Pickering, and so he did a series of these patterns by the looks of it.
And I never thought about the animation aspect of spinners and loaders as far as it bothering people. So Eeva, do those kind of things bother you? Or like if somebody tapped into that, made that API in their React to let somebody reduce that motion, that'd be preferable. I think that's what some people are asking as well.
Yeah, I think like about problematic movement, I can speak from the like as a person who has a vestibular disorder and like from that point of view. So I can't really say about this distracting side, but like from my side, I think having small animations and like that don't take really much space on the screen, it's usually okay. And if it's not going, like a loading spinner that's rather big and going fast, that can be really problematic actually. But like smaller and slower loading animations are better for me, I think.
So instead of removing animations, you could make secondary animations, or like animations that don't distract so much.
Yeah, basically yes, because like it is called reduced motion, not like removed motion. So like that's also an option to slow down things and or make them like smaller, for example. So yeah.
Yeah, okay, makes sense. So there's a question: should we announce and let users know that the content has loaded too? So after content finished loading, what do we do?
Once the page is loaded, the content is going to be there so that they'll be immediately able to interact with it, unless you're loading only part of a page, so where the page hasn't finished loading. But if you're loading whole pages, then you don't need to do anything more. If you're loading sections of a page, again, we have to rely on the ARIA Live attribute on the section that is loading.
Yeah, so just to clarify, so like in my use case, I have a table and there's a search, and the search can take a couple of seconds. So should I announce after this completes that, yeah, it's done, or this area live will take care of it? How does it go for these queries I can invoke in a page that you can see? So you have a table, then you have a search, then you type something, you wait a couple of seconds.
If you're only loading part of the page, I would, in the context of a search page, I would recommend putting an area live on the search results. So basically, actually, let me see if I can. It's going to load quickly.
Yeah, we can really share your screen if you want to show.
Yeah, then just there we go. Where is the share screen? Right. So I would put somewhere in the search result. 3 results for. So what I would do is something like this, where I would have a paragraph that changes based on the number of results found and the search term. And I would put an area live around that. So once the search is done and it has found however many results for whichever terms, you have this there, and it's giving the information about the user. Okay, well, the search is completed because context changed, the text in the paragraph changed, and it reminds people what they were searching for and how many results. So if you have something like that, it's going to be announced. So you conduct a search, and then the screen reader is doing whatever it is it's doing. When it's done with that, then it will announce what's in this. So if you change the text with for cats sewing, every time the search, the text in that paragraph changes, it's going to be announced by the screen readers. So this is a good way to inform screen reader users that something changed, that the search is complete. Don't put the area live attribute on your entire table of results, because then the entire table of results is going to be announced, and then suddenly that becomes really really tricky from a cognitive load perspective.
Yeah, that's a really cool thing to know. And I guess you could, if you don't want to show the text for other people, you could have it inside this hidden container or so.
Yeah, you can hide it, absolutely. But why would you hide it? The number of people that would benefit from this information, whether it's someone who has cognitive impairment, someone who's distracted, someone who doesn't know easily how many search, if you have 200 results and you break that into 20 pages of 10 results, it's helpful to actually have the information right there. Okay, there's 210 results for this search term. It's good information. So designers may think, oh yeah, I'm going to pollute my design by having this information, but by making it available for everyone, you increase the usability of your search page tremendously.
Yeah, that's a really cool point, because it's doing accessibility feature. It doesn't mean it's away from other users. So it's actually improving the experience overall. Yeah. So since we're running out of time, maybe we should wrap up the session. So what are sort of like takeaways or like parting thoughts for followers or people watching? We can do a little round.
Accessibility is a technical solution for a problem that impacts people, and just do it.
Yeah.
Yes, accessibility is good for your skill set. It makes you a better developer, and it makes you a better human. And you're not only including people with disabilities, which is the key here, but you actually often make it better for everyone and improves usability.
Yeah, and I just these are great thoughts, and I just want to add to that thought that was discussed at some point, that there are people who have a disability, and then there are people who don't yet have a disability. So this is also it's not for a small group of people, but it's for everybody.
Great. Yeah, that's a cool way to end the session. And I think next time we're going to look at full stack React, like these full stack solutions available, Next.js and some others. And it's going to take place in a month. But thanks a lot, everyone. And I think we had a great session. So see you.